Good morning, everybody. Baroness Morris, President of the World Travel Market London Advisory Council, Taleb Rifai, Secretary General of the United Nations World Tourism Organization, with whom we launched WTM World Responsible Tourism Day. Welcome to World Travel Market's World Responsible Tourism Day 2015. WRTD is the largest day of responsible tourism action in the world. It is not only the many sessions and exhibitor involvement on the exhibition floor, but what is taking place in many countries and communities around the world under the banner of WRTD. You can see many of the examples of participating projects on the screen behind me. I'm proud to say these projects are taking place quite literally all over the world, including Vietnam, Mongolia, Mexico, Nepal, USA, Argentina, India, Kenya, Ukraine, and of course here in the UK. Since its launch in 2006, WTM World Responsible Tourism Day has set the wider agenda in the travel industry. This year, we have grander ambitions to set the global agenda. Carbon emissions was a major topic of conversation, debate, and action for the travel industry in the mid-2000s. Then the global financial downturn hit and the issue, unfortunately, dropped off the agenda. Travel companies were understandably battling for their mere existence and at best were focused on protecting margins, controlling costs, and encouraging consumers, many of whom were also feeling a financial squeeze, to continue their holidaying habits. In a few weeks' time, the world's superpowers will try once again to agree a global consensus on carbon emissions reduction. The Paris Convention at the end of the month follows on from a similar meeting in Copenhagen in 2009. There are many experts, including our keynote address this morning, that believe this is critical for the world to save itself. Kevin Anderson is Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester, Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change, and advises the Prime Minister's Office on carbon trading. Kevin is by no means a supporter of the travel industry, its record on reducing carbon emissions, or a believer that it is taking its responsibilities on climate change seriously. However, as part of WTM World Responsible Tourism Day, we want to be completely open and frank with you. We want to present the facts directly and honestly. We aim to show both sides of the argument. Above all, we provide the platform to facilitate positive change within the industry. Kevin, who refuses to fly due to the impact it has on the environment, is the perfect keynote speaker to do this and set a controversial yet vital debate for the day. Responsible tourism is the backbone of this industry. It helps us to give back to struggling communities, to conserve amazing biodiversity, stunning scenery, and extraordinary heritage and teeming wildlife. World Travel Market's own research shows holidaymakers want to experience sustainable holidays and appreciate both the vital role I've outlined, but also the irrefutable damage tourism can do when not managed correctly. With this in mind, the travel industry must continue to embrace responsible tourism. It is an issue which cannot drop off the agenda should the world find itself in another global financial crisis. Research suggests up to 40% of travellers are prepared to pay more for sustainable holidays, which shows the clear business case for responsible tourism. I expect the debate with Kevin's address to be extremely fierce, with senior leaders from Boeing, Hyatt, South African government, and of course Taleb Rifai, Secretary General, WTO, joining Kevin to discuss travel's commitment to the environment and climate reduction. Despite the criticism we may hear from Kevin, there are many great examples of strong, responsible tourism practices in the industry, And these will be rightly highlighted and applauded in the World Responsible Tourism Awards at WTM, which will be revealed later on in this session. Finally, I'm very proud of the commitment World Travel Market portfolio of events have to promoting responsible tourism. As well as WRTD, we have expanded the tourism programme around the world into Arabian Travel Market, WTM Latin America, and WTM Africa. We are now going to watch a short feature from the BBC Travel Show, directed by and presented by journalist Ben Zan. The video will present a young person's view of the impact of climate change and give us all something to think about before Kevin's keynote address and the panel debate. Thank you very much and have an enjoyable session.
In my job for the BBC Travel Show, I get to see and do amazing things all over the world. Like riding a horse through the Kazakh mountains with my Kazakh cowboy friend here, kiteboarding across an old, disused runway in Berlin, or traveling through China using only my smartphone as a guide. I'm a young, curious man in my 20s, and I count myself lucky because travel is now so much more accessible than it ever has been. Not just for people like me on television, but for everyone. With low-cost airlines, endless amounts of trip information online, and apps that help you get everywhere. Seemingly with a smartphone and some cash in your pocket, nowhere is off limits. For the first time in my life, I understand Chinese. And this makes me happy, very happy. But should I be feeling guilty too? Climate change is something I was taught about at school. We learned that our generation needed to think about doing things differently and take an active role in protecting the environment. We were told that the future of the planet was down to us. But despite what we learnt in the classroom, my generation is travelling more, not less. Many of us recycle, but few of us think twice before booking a flight. Out here in the real world, there are just so many different opinions and viewpoints. Some say we need to stop travelling altogether. They say that people like me are contributing to destroying the planet and ruining local cultures, all in the name of just having a good time. As I clock up the air miles, I know that air travel is considered to be one of the most environmentally damaging forms of transport ever invented. And although lighter planes and more efficient engines are already with us, the problem hasn't really gone away. But it's not just about selfie opportunities in some amazing places. For a start, a study in 2013 by the Global Coalition on Aging claims that travel also keeps us feeling younger and healthier. Plus, the travel industry gives jobs to almost 300 million people all over the world. And think about all the money people like me are leaving behind in local economies. And I'm probably turning into a more open-minded, tolerant, and culturally aware person along the way too. So what's not to love about travel? English? Do you speak English? Or maybe my get out of jail card is something to do with moderation, making subtle but effective changes that collectively might help save us from a global catastrophe that could be heading our way. But are all those messages about reusing hotel towels and carbon offsetting just a subtle marketing ploy aimed at people like me who know they should probably be doing more but have no intention of burning their passport and staying at home? There are some who say I shouldn't even be worried by any of this. They say climate change is a natural, not man-made phenomenon. And if things get really bad, we can move to another planet, or a pandemic will slash the number of humans, and we'll head back to some kind of natural equilibrium. Problem solved. But is that really the best idea? Carry on destroying the Earth until science or nature sort things out. These are just a few of the arguments that will potentially compromise me doing what I love most, traveling the world. But what do you think I should do? Nice to meet you. I'm Benjamin.
Right, after that rather challenging billing, I'm going to talk for the next few minutes a whistle-stop tour on climate change. And I've called this the ostrich or the phoenix, hopefully metaphors you're all familiar with. The ostrich is what we've done on climate change for a quarter of a century, put our heads in the sand and pretended nothing is happening or nothing is going to change, that we don't have to adjust the way we live our lives. Or the phoenix, which is emerging from, I think, the fossil fuel flames with a new way of thinking of the world. Academically, there's a subtitle to this, which is the sort of exotic term cognitive dissonance, which I often think of as just simply hypocrisy. Or the other version of that is creativity in a changing climate. Actually, can we think very differently about the world in which we live? And I will argue that we have to think fundamentally differently about our world. For those who are interested in modern forms of communication, generally lowish carbon, I have a Twitter account which I only use for work. It's nothing about my sporting activities or what I had for tea, and I always have a website where I can write what I like, and my university can't stop me putting it there. So a lot of what I'm talking about today is actually available in this paper, which was recently published in a Nature journal, and it is available free online. So if anyone's interested in the more detailed side of it, it is all there. But I'm going to start off with what we, many of us here, members of democracies, our governments have signed up to things on climate change. So we effectively all have signed up to something similar to this. This is from the Copenhagen Accord. It could be from Doha or Cancun or any other exotic location that these events ever are. To hold the increase in global temperature below 2 degrees C, notice that below, doesn't say 50-50 chance of, take action to meet that objective consistent with science and on the basis of equity. So we have all signed up to that. But before I go any further, this 2 degrees C framework, which on a cold day in Manchester, where I come from, sounds quite attractive, it's the regional repercussions of that matter. That's about 6 degrees in the poles. We also have to bear in mind, at 2 degrees C warming, which is the best that we can now really hope for, many millions of people will die. They'll be poor, and they will live in the southern hemisphere primarily. There will be low-lying states, they'll be around the deltas, there'll be the 30 million people living on the coastal strip of Bangladesh, or at least some of them. So even at 2 degrees C, we are prepared to sacrifice the lives of many poor, low-emitting people who actually do not really, probably are not common tourists anyway, put it that way. So though we've signed up to that, what's our record so far? Well, the first report from the IPCC came out in 1990, 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago, probably longer ago than some of you have been on this planet, actually. And nothing has significantly changed since from the science. We knew everything we needed to know then, 25 years ago, to deal with climate change. We just chose to do nothing about it. Since the last set of reports from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we've dumped 200 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That will be changing the climate, as will the lights on in here today and how we got to this event, for the next 100 to 10,000 years, and the science is absolutely clear about that. The emissions of carbon dioxide this year will be 60% higher than when we first pretended to care about climate change in 1990. 60% higher. And the concentration, in other words, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is higher now than it has been for at least 800,000 years, possibly 5 million years. 800,000 years is about 3 times longer than humans have been on the planet. None of us in particular, but as a species. So that's our catalogue of abject failure on climate change. What has changed, and this is a really crucial issue, and it's challenging to every sector, not just the tourist sector, but to all sectors, to all of us as individuals, to science community, to policymakers, is that in terms of temperature, what really matters are carbon budgets, our build-up of carbon dioxide day in, day out. Every single day we emit carbon, it remains in the atmosphere for 100 to 10,000 years, changing the climate. It is not about long-term 2050 targets. These have absolutely nothing to do with climate science, and we should never have been using them. It is the build-up of CO2 day in, day out that matters, and that is much more challenging for all of us. My headline conclusion, despite this sort of really gloomy start, is that 2 degrees C is just about viable. We can just about hold to it, but the chances now are very slim. We are in the sort of 2/3 type, 3 degrees C temperature rise realm if we do everything we reasonably can. And as I'll say in a minute, at the moment, we're heading much higher than that. My hypothesis, which again is quite an unattractive one, is that if we are serious about 2 degrees C, we need to dramatically reduce our consumption of energy in the short to medium term, and that's particularly the wealthy parts of the world. But the argument is typically, well, surely we can do that with engineering of one sort or another. And as an engineer that used to work on oil rigs, I think engineering can do a lot, but we cannot perform miracles. Biofuels, wind, solar, nuclear, carbon capture and storage, so forth. These are all low carbon or lowish carbon options. Surely we can solve it with those. But in 2015, it is all about timing. It is the timing that matters. And say we have squandered a quarter of a century in choosing to do nothing on climate change so far. So let's just have a graph here. For those of you that like numbers, it's the carbon dioxide emissions at one side and years out along the bottom. But don't worry too much about the numbers, just look at the shape of the curve. The curve is of carbon emissions, or as I often say, it's a plot of our arrogance or an inverse plot of our concern for the climate. The UN panel on climate change was set up in 1988. The first report was out in 1990. For those with grey hair or no hair, they might remember the first Rio summit in 1992, very optimistic and appropriately so, about what we could achieve. We then had the Kyoto Protocol that was ratified later on. We had the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, and we had the Rio plus 20. Often people think of as Rio plus 20 years. I think of it as Rio plus 20 billion tons, because that's what we've dumped in the atmosphere during our period of concern. So you see the rise then in carbon dioxide emissions year on year. And despite the recent economic downturn, we've still seen emissions rising at about 2 to 3% per year. Maybe this year could be a little different, but quite high, well, very high rates of increase, about 2 or 3 times higher than the rate of increase we had in the 1990s. As we build power stations, high carbon power stations, gas-fired, coal-fired, as we build infrastructures, sewage networks, roads, train networks, those sorts of things, as we build hotels, buildings like this, as we buy aircraft and ships, we lock the future into doing things with high carbon sort of facilities that we have built. So we are, every single year as we construct these things, locking the future into using high carbon fuels and energy for the next 20, 30, 40, up to 100 years. So this is what we're doing at the moment, and this is what we have to fundamentally change. Not in the future, but now. We have to start now. We should have started 25 years ago. We are heading in this direction at the moment, 4 to 6 degrees C. This is a profoundly different world. This is where we're going if we carry on doing what we're doing at the moment. And this supports the view of the International Energy Agency, not a left-wing think tank, normally thought of as being the sort of the voice of the orthodox energy sector, but actually it says some very interesting things now, that the trend of CO2 is perfectly in line with a temperature increase of 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, 6 degrees Celsius. And that would have devastating consequences for the planet. That is a different place to live. It is nothing like the world in which we live today. And that's from the IEA. You find similar things from the World Bank or the IMF as well. But what about 2 degrees C? That's the direction of travel that we need to have. A fundamentally different one from the 4 to 6 degrees that we're on. And my contention here is that actually in the short term, there is nothing we can do with energy supply to get us off the higher curve. So we have to do something very different. We have to reduce our energy demand. And that's not just everyone around the planet. There are those of us that consume the lion's share of emissions, and we know who they are. We see them when we put our makeup on or have a shave in the morning. They're staring back at us from the mirror. We know the group that are responsible for most of the emissions. Now, the supply side is really important, but it will take longer to be put in place. So we must proceed with the supply, but we have to do something about demand. And this is a global analysis. You know, when we think about it, actually most parts of the world are not part of this problem. Or at least many of the people in those countries aren't. 300 million people in China consume like we do. 1 billion people in China do not. And that's the same for many parts of the world. There are many, many poorer people there who have very low levels of energy consumption. We have signed up to deal with climate change on the basis of equity. That's what we've signed up to. We should be concerned about the poorer parts of the world, the low-emitting parts of the world that will suffer the consequences of our profligate use of carbon. So if we think about that for 2 degrees C, think about it for us as tourists. What would that mean? You can read about the maths behind this in the paper that I pointed out earlier. But we need to have reductions of about 10% every single year in carbon dioxide emissions. And we should have started a few years ago, really. What does that mean when we think, if we play those numbers out? It's about a 40% reduction in the next few years in our carbon dioxide emissions. And remember, those of us that are higher emissions than the average, which is probably almost everyone in this room, would have to make even larger reductions than that. About a 70% reduction by the mid-2020s, and be virtually carbon-free by the early 2030s for the wealthy parts of the world. And the reason for this is that it allows the poorer parts of the world access to fossil fuels so they can improve their welfare. We know categorically that the welfare of the poor is improved if they have access to energy. In the short term, that will be fossil fuels. We also know categorically that the welfare of the wealthy parts of the world, particularly the wealthy people in the wealthier parts of the world, is not improved by access to fossil fuels, additional energy, not access to it, but additional energy. And we know this categorically from repeated scientific investigations. These reductions are radical. They are fundamentally different. They will require profound changes to how people like us live our lives. But if 2 degrees C is too challenging, and we say we're on 2/3 at the moment, what about 4 degrees C? What are the global impacts of 4 degrees C? This is where we're going at the moment. Just think of the heat waves around the globe and what would happen to those. It's the extremes that really matter. When we add a climate signal on top of the existing heat waves. In Europe in 2003, when 20 to 30,000 people died, imagine making that heat wave longer and then adding 8 degrees on top of it. Imagine adding 6 degrees in Beijing or Shanghai, where the buildings have no thermal mass. They will not be able to live in those buildings. In New York and other parts of North America, 10 to 12 degrees warmer. So a 4 degrees C temperature warming has these sort of impacts during these extreme events. This is a fundamentally different way of having to live our lives. At the same time, we'll see large increases of sea level. It's hard to say exactly what they would look like, and we know they're going to continue to go up. Certainly at 3 or 4 degrees C, we're going to melt all of Greenland, but it will take many hundreds of years. But that is 7 meters sea level rise. But by the end of the century, a meter is not unreasonable to think that that's where we're heading, a meter sea level rise and increased severity of typhoons in the southern hemisphere. And at the same time, we're going to see big reductions in the production of staple food crops, maize, sorghum, rice, wheat, those sorts of things, particularly in the lower latitudes, whilst the population is heading towards 9 billion people. You put all of that together, and there's a widespread view that 4 degrees C is incompatible with an organized global community. We will reach for the Kalashnikov and start killing each other, rather than trying to deal with the scarce resources that will be available. It's a very common approach. We always like to blame someone else for the problems that we face. It is beyond adaptation. Many people in the world will not be able to adapt. Often we say, well, we'll be able to adapt. What we mean by that is rich people in the northern hemisphere will be able to deal with these climate impacts. We don't really care that much about the poor who will suffer the consequences of it. And they will not be able to adapt. Many of them will simply die, particularly at 4 degrees C. It is devastating to ecosystems, right? We'll have wiped out the barrier reef and the Amazon and things like that. But also, think of the ecosystem services that are provided for us, the pollination of our crops by bees. These sorts of things will have fundamentally changed as well. And it is unlikely to be stable. Tipping points, non-linearities, discontinuities. The temperature will likely keep going up because we will have triggered natural phenomena like the melting of the permafrost and the releasing of methane. So I think it's fair to say that across the scientific community, and even some of the climate skeptics, would argue that 4 degrees C should be avoided. And I would argue at all costs. We cannot go to that sort of future. We have to avoid going there. And yet that at the moment is exactly where we're heading. So let's return to 2 degrees C. What would that mean for a sector like us, the tourist sector? Well, it's much more than towels, which is what what I come across when I stay in hotels. It's things that are going to be really very problematic. We will have to think, how do we do things fundamentally differently? Deep reductions in flying. Now. Starting now. Massive retrofit of hotels and resorts. Any new hotels and resorts effectively should be passive designs. They should use no external energy. And we should be retrofitting the existing ones to be virtually like that. And given I appear to spend half my life in hotels, they are nothing like that. They have huge energy consumption, as my experience at the moment anyway. Slow cruising. You can dramatically reduce the amount of emissions by doing things slowly, whether that's train travel or whether it's ship travel. Tricky with aircraft. So we need to be thinking about slow travel for ships, retrofit, and renewable ships, renewable powered ships, that should say. In the short term, whilst we actually put low carbon energy supply in place, we need to encourage indigenous tourism. Not on top of international tourism, but as a replacement for it. And when we do go internationally, we need to travel much slower, take much longer about how we do these things. Again, that will change how we have to live our lives, the sorts of structures we have at work and so forth. No city breaks, or very few city breaks, at least they're facilitated by air. I mean, we must bear in mind, though we like to think there's the poor that are starting to travel a lot, actually, generally, it's something like 2 to 3 times the median salary of the people that travel on the planes. It's not the poor that are driving up the use of aircraft. It is generally the wealthy who are traveling by them much more often. We need to lead by example. Now, I can say that for every sector. But today I'm talking about tourism. I often talk about shale gas or the shipping sector. But someone somewhere has to step up and say, we will make those changes. At the moment, everyone's saying, let the others make it and we won't bother. So is the tourism prepared to do that? If not, probably the tourism industry, more than many others, will start to feel the repercussions of our abject failure on climate change. We will decimate the industry that we've come to love and enjoy in the places we love to go and visit. We will decimate them. We will kill the people there. We will destroy the ecosystems. That's the direction that we're heading at the moment. The science is categorically clear on this, despite what we might read in the Daily Mail and the Telegraph. If we are serious about a 2 degrees C framing of climate change, and as I said before, 2 degrees C is not safe if you're poor and in the southern hemisphere. It means deep reductions in energy demand. And we need a Marshall-style plan to build low-carbon energy supply. Once we've got low-carbon energy supply, at least from a carbon perspective, we can carry on living life as we do today. There will be a whole host of sustainability concerns, but from a carbon perspective, it's the low-carbon supply we need. But in the interim, we must reduce demand. And that low-carbon supply needs to be in place by about 2050 with virtually 100% penetration. Ultimately, we have to escape the reductionist mindset of the 20th century, phenomenally successful through Industrial Revolution. As an engineer, that's what we use, reductionist way of thinking of the world. Universities are premised on this. We split the world into physics, maths, engineering, arts, humanities, economics even. We split the world like that, but the world isn't like that. When we go outside, the world is the mush of all those things together. And yet we have no real framework of knowing how to think about systemic challenges. We have never faced systemic challenges like we are facing now, at many levels, but certainly in relation to climate change. 7 to 9 billion people, a globalized world, huge levels of consumption by the few, but everyone trying to aspire to that sort of model. We don't really know how to resolve those problems. We have a blank sheet of paper, which as an academic is quite an attractive prospect. But we do know that to get out of this, we're going to require leadership, courage, innovative thinking, engaged teams, difficult choices. We're going to get a lot of things wrong because we really do not have really many historical precedents about how to deal with these sorts of challenges. I mean, there are no, the changing from CFCs to HCFCs in terms of the ozone layer or the removal or the solutions we came to with acid rain are not good precedents for dealing with climate change. Carbon isn't everything we do. It's in the paint on here. It's in the clothes that we wear. It's in how we travel here today. We have never had to deal with something that pervasive and remove it from the system in a few decades. We will get things wrong. And let's not pretend it's going to be win-win. There's a lot of green growth myth out there. It's going to hurt, and it's going to hurt particularly those of us that live carbon-profligate lives. And again, I think we know who they are. In the short term, we are going to have to reduce the things that we do, and that will affect the quality of our lives. But that's a depressing way to finish. So I'm going to finish off with a quote from Robert Unger, and I think, I always use this quote. I've never given many royalties for it. But I think it captures the hope, the prospects for the future, and probably in many different challenges that we face. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to see that it could be different. And that's exactly what we require now. We need to imagine what different futures will look like. The future will be radically different from the present, either because we've done something about it and reducing our emissions, or because we'll be hit by climate change. And it will hit us in the wealthy parts of the world, though it will take a decade or two longer. But imagination is not enough. We need clarity. How are we going to put these alternative futures in place? And that is the job of all of us, to think what would those futures need to look like. In this sector, what would a tourism world have to look like if it had to have an 80% reduction in its carbon emissions in the next 2 decades? What would that world look like? And how could we deliver it? And if we think of the world like that, then I think we just about can hold to a 2°C future. So on that, I think, upbeat note, thank you very much for listening.
Wow. Well, you know what? Sometimes presentations that involve statistics and graphs and figures, they can get a little sort of, let's face it, a little boring sometimes. But that was the absolute opposite. You know, that it was both incredibly depressing in many ways, but also, to me, it felt hugely important to have you say it and not sugarcoat it. And there was no sugarcoating at all. And I think you've given us so much now to talk about with our panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just introduce myself very quickly. I'm Stephen Sacker. My day job is to work for the BBC for the Hard Talk show on BBC World News. I present the Hard Talk show. Many of you will know me, not necessarily just because you see me on your hotel TV screen from time to time, but also because I come back here every year. It's been my great honor and privilege to be involved with World Responsible Tourism Day for more years than I care to remember now, but I keep coming back because it seems very important to me. And so today it's my privilege to chair a debate that's going to pick up on many of the themes that Kevin has just laid out. So let me, without further ado, invite up onto the stage our panel members. I'm going to invite them all up. They'll all come up and then give them all a very warm hand. Otherwise, we'll be here all day just clapping and our hands will get very, very tired. So please do come up onto the stage. Richard Mills, he's a senior executive at Boeing Corporation with responsibility for their sustainability policy. Please welcome Brigitte Witt from Hyatt Hotel Group. She's the global head of corporate responsibility. Taleb Rifai, who many of you will know is Secretary General of the UN World Tourism Organization. And please also welcome Derek Hanekom, who is the Minister for Tourism in South Africa. If all of you would make your way to the stage and sit in the order I introduced you next to Kevin. So, Richard, you go next to Kevin, then Brigitte, then Taleb, and Derek closest to me. Thank you all for joining me. for this panel discussion. We're really today chewing over what Kevin has told us about the realities of where we sit on this planet right now in terms of the climate change challenge, in terms of what needs to be done to get anywhere close to reducing CO2 emissions to a level where we can be optimistic that we can control the warming of our planetary climate to a point where it is tolerable. Kevin says even at 2 degrees, there are many people in many parts of the world who are going to suffer great pain. But if it goes beyond 2 degrees, closer to 4, it's going to be absolutely disastrous, pretty much in every part of the world. So before getting into the detail, I want each of you very honestly and frankly to tell me how you responded to Kevin's very clear, tough message, given the different hats, the different places you sit in the travel and tourism business. So, Richard, you work for Boeing, perhaps the biggest aircraft manufacturer in the world. When you hear Kevin's message, what do you think?
So, from a Boeing perspective, Boeing takes climate change and pollution very seriously as issues, and we are committed to develop innovative solutions to enable the world to have a more sustainable future, and we take that very seriously. Now, Boeing, along with the aviation industry, other manufacturers, airport operators, and air traffic management organizations collectively have signed up to some global goals, and those are to achieve a 1.5% annual efficiency improvement for the aviation industry, to achieve net carbon neutral growth by 2020, and achieve a net 50% in emissions by 2050. And
let me stop you there. That's not good enough. According to Kevin's data analysis, you know, that simply isn't good enough.
Well, I think what we're seeing is we are starting to see a decoupling of aviation growth from carbon emissions. So I think the hypothesis that's been put forward that cutting demand is the answer is we see another solution, which is innovation. And we are seeing a lot of innovation to address this. Now, there's 3 areas that we are focusing on. So one is introducing more fuel-efficient aircraft. And that's happening already. So, for example, the 787 Dreamliner that's in production is 20% more fuel efficient than the aircraft it replaces. And what that means is you get 20% lower emissions today. And this aircraft is on mass production.
But what if there are 20% more aircraft flying? What if there are 20% more people taking flights every year? I mean, the issue in the end, he says, and I don't want to speak for him too much, I'll let him speak for himself in a minute, but it's all about this urgent need to address the demand side of the equation. He says, frankly, we all have to accept, particularly in the rich world, that people should fly less. In fact, much less.
Well, there's also another option, which is also to take the fuel, the existing kerosene fuel, and replace it by sustainable jet fuel. Now, sustainable jet fuel offers up to 80% life cycle carbon emission savings compared to kerosene fuel. And that's because it's taken from waste sources or sources where it absorbs carbon dioxide when it grows.
So you're saying it has a 0 carbon emission overall effect?
It offers huge potential reductions, up to 80% compared to existing jet fuel.
So in the spirit of urgency, when can we expect that to be filling our aircraft tanks as we board an aircraft?
Well, it's already been approved for use in aviation. It's been produced at small scale. It's been certified as being sustainable by highly regarded sustainability bodies like the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials. The private sector is playing a huge role to advance this, and Boeing's been playing a leadership role in demonstrating the potential of this fuel. What would enable even faster progress is additional government support. That's because it's a new emerging technology, and like many other emerging technologies, having government support at the very early stages is often key.
What were your corporate profits last year?
I don't recall the exact numbers, but I think
give me a ballpark within $100 million.
So, I mean, so Boeing's role is to invest
Yeah,
money
but no,
from-
seriously, what were your corporate, roughly, what were your corporate profits last year?
So we have been investing lots of money in
But what were
developing
your
new
corporate, I mean, you can't, you know, he says these things are urgent and everybody has to clarify their thinking, to use their imaginations. You've just said to me, oh, we can't really deliver urgently on this new zero carbon fuel concept without massive government support. And yet we know that Boeing is a huge, one of the world's most successful corporations with one of the world's biggest annual profits.
And we have actually been investing those profits in developing these innovative solutions. So we've been investing a lot of money to demonstrate the fuels. We've been investing a lot of money in terms of developing far more environmentally friendly aircraft. We've been using money to demonstrate new air traffic management techniques that save fuel because it's more efficient. So we've been playing our part and doing a lot. I think what we're looking for in terms of the industry is a level playing field with the sorts of support that ground transport biofuels get. So, for example, there are financial incentives that are provided in some countries for ground transport biofuels. And if aviation could also have access to those, that would enable sustainable fuels to be price competitive.
All right, well,
fuels.
Richard, I'm going to stop you there because that's very helpful, and you've pointed us in some positive directions. That you say that the aviation industry is and can do more to pursue. Kevin, I want you to come back on what you hear later, but I want to go right round the panel first to hear from the different sectors what is the thinking, the response to your presentation, and also what's being done. So, Brigitte, you know, you work in corporate responsibility at Hyatt. Again, simple thought from you. Respond to what Kevin has said. I mean, did you have a huge sort of gulp? How did you feel when you heard his challenge to companies like yours?
Not a gulp, because this is information that I've heard before, that Hyatt has heard before, that we're very familiar with. And for that reason, we've taken a very concerted effort to make sure that as a company, we work, we're very focused on reducing our emissions. For us, it's a sustainability imperative, it's a business imperative, as a way to manage our hotels more efficiently. But quite frankly, we also know that the future of our industry, as Kevin indicated, is in peril if we don't do something about it. Climate change isn't just about, you know, rising sea levels that could potentially impact our resorts. It could impact every aspect of our business, right? We know that climate change has the potential to lead to political and social instability. It has the potential to lead to drought and food scarcity. So for us, it's absolutely a business imperative.
Can I dig down into some of the detail of what you do then? How many hotels does the Hyatt Group operate?
We have about 600 hotels,
Okay.
The majority of which we manage or franchise.
How many are you currently involved in building? How many new hotels are in your pipeline at the moment?
Gosh, I think we have probably about 100 or so hotels in our pipeline. I'm not sure about
That's
that.
a huge
Some of
number.
that data I can't.
Yeah, so that's a major expansion of what you... So the message is every new hotel right now should be planned with a zero external energy footprint.
So the steps
is that what's happening?
The steps that we're taking as a company is really on three levels. One, we've set some very aggressive targets to reduce our energy consumption and our carbon emissions. And for us as an industry, the easiest way to manage carbon emissions right now is to focus on energy reduction. Our goal is to reduce our carbon and energy consumption by 25%. We've hit that target in Europe, in EMEA and Southwest Asia, and we're at about 17% in the Americas and in Asia Pacific. That's the first thing that we're doing.
I mean, that's a long way from what Kevin was talking about, which is hotels having zero external energy footprint.
But it's 25%.
No, but I mean, he's saying this is all really urgent. You know, we know for years, with respect, you know, corporates, companies like yours have seen an importance to saying we're committed to reducing our emissions, we're committed to everything from, you know, towel reuse to more important things, you know, low carbon, much more efficient use of energy, et cetera, et cetera. We know all of that. But he's saying that the ambition, the targets you set yourselves have to be much, much more dramatic, more ambitious than they've ever been before. So I'm trying to dig down, see if yours are way different from they were even 4 years, 3 years ago.
Fundamentally different. We established a completely new sustainability strategy last year that we launched. A second piece of that strategy is to make sure that the hotels that we start to build starting next year have sustainability built into every aspect of the development process. This is incredibly important because we know that buildings emit about 30% of the world's CO2. They consume about 40% of the world's energy. And so we're taking very concerted steps to make sure that the hotels that we start to build in the future can meet that challenge. And I think one of the things that is a constant, I think, obstacle for us is the cost of clean energy. We have a lot of really fantastic examples of hotels around the world where by being able to take advantage of tax incentives, reductions in the cost of technology, we're able to make a significant impact. We recently invested in a Bloom fuel cell. Helps us to reduce the carbon emissions of the hotel in which we've installed it by 40%. That's huge. We're only able to do that because we were able to take advantage of tax incentives that allowed us to do that. The cost of LED light bulbs has been reduced substantially, which has led to a massive adoption in our industry of that technology. And so for us, it's putting the right policies in place, but also making sure that there's accessibility to the technology that will help us to meet our goals.
And in terms of your overall growth strategy for the future, do you buy into this idea that there will have to be less international tourism?
Well, I don't know that there has to be less. I think it can be done better. I think it can be, our hotels can be more efficient, airlines can be more efficient. The way that we manage destinations.
You stick to a growth model, basically, you know, a continuous, permanent, never-ending growth model.
I don't know if it's never-ending, but we certainly have a growth model.
Well, you don't see any end to it, that's for sure. Okay.
It's certainly a growth model, sure.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much. Talib, you for a long time have, you know, sat atop the UN's tourism organization, and I guess your message has always been, you know, tourism's a huge positive, tourism's a great thing, we need more and more and more of it, everybody in the world should have, you know, access to it and enjoy it. Do you think that message of positivity needs to be remodeled, rethought?
Oh, that's a question. Yes, definitely. Let me first start by saying that I enjoyed tremendously Kevin's presentation. I think it's one of the most compelling, one of the most convincing presentations I've ever had, and I think we need to use you much more often than this. I think the whole world needs to listen to this and needs to see the seriousness of this. But I must say that I have 3 to 4 observations that I would like to put on the table, including the growth model that you talked about, from a UN perspective, which is interested in sustainability altogether, and inclusive growth, and from a travel and tourism perspective as well. So let me, if you don't mind, just main 4 points. Number 1, this is a global issue, as Kevin correctly said. It cannot be dealt with, it cannot be addressed at any national or regional level. And that's why the UN needs to be at the forefront of this. We all need to tackle this. Climate change and any other sustainability issues do not have borders and do not limit themselves to any particular locality. 2, we need to look at the model of sustainability in all its pillars, not just in the environmental pillar. I completely agree that if life stops on Earth and if all the predictions that correctly were arrived at by Kevin's presentation, then there is no sense in doing anything else. But there are 3 pillars of sustainability: environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability. And we need to look at the whole package together. We can't just see one side of the story and ignore the others. 3, growth is not the enemy, if that answers your question directly. The story of mankind on Earth is a story of growth. It's how we grow that we should be addressing. Because if we start seeing growth, progress, as the enemy, and that's where I come a little bit, have some difficulty with your conclusions, Kevin, at the end, to say less is better, less is more, less travel, less flying is more. I think that's running away from the problem. That's not addressing the problem. That has to do with the Ugar's quote that you said at the end, clarity, yes, but imagination is being compromised here. I completely agree with Stephen's call for the airline industry, for the hospitality industry, to do more faster. But to up to the option of less growth, let's curb growth, let's stop traveling, let's stop. Every human activity on Earth has a downside to it. Life has a downside to it. We don't stop life. We should address it in a much more aggressive and much more imaginative manner. The last point I want to make is about travel and tourism itself. Travel and tourism, when it comes to climate change, is definitely a contributor. It's a vector of it. And our estimates are that it's emitting between 3.9 to 6% carbon emission, about 5%. 5% is the right thing, between 3.9 to 6%. So the average is about 5%, 2/3 of which are coming from the transport industry, and the rest is coming from other activities that are there. It's not 20%, it's not 25%, it's 5%, but it's 5% too many. And we should be the example, we should be the model, and that I completely agree with Kevin on. But again, travel and tourism, and particularly tourism, is also a victim of climate change, and we tend to forget this. Our greatest asset is the natural capital and the cultural capital. And when we consume them, when we damage them, we're hurting ourselves. We're both a victor and a victim of climate change, and we need to keep that in mind. But my most important message, Stephen, to you, and I think the direct answer to your question, is I would stick to the fact that we should be very, very careful about looking at growth as the enemy. To the contrary, we should embrace growth, because growth can generate more revenues, and more revenues can be and should be implemented in this cause.
But you don't like the idea of pain, and Kevin says there is going to have to be some pain.
Well, I like the idea of paying, but paying through more growth, because more growth generates more revenues, and you pay from more revenues. And my call on the airline industry and on the hospitality industry is earn more money and pay more money. But you can't just stop the growth, because when you do that, when you up to less flying, there are communities in island communities that are so dependent on tourism and so dependent on trade that would suffer tremendously from cutting down air traffic to these islands. What do you tell these people? What do you tell these people? We need to do this because this is good for everybody else in the world? What about my livelihood? What about my food? What about my earnings?
Well, these are questions that I hope Kevin might respond to in just a moment. But before he does, I want to bring Derek Hannacum in. Thank you very much, Taleb, for that. Derek, you represent a government here. Taleb represents the UN as an organization, but you have national responsibilities. And, I wonder, when you reflect on the state of the tourism industry in South Africa, and then you reflect on what Kevin's just said, whether you think it's time at a national level for a bit of a rethink.
Yeah, more than a bit of a rethink, a serious rethink. And I think what Kevin's presentation did is, well, as you said, there was no sugarcoating, it was hard-hitting, it was provocative and thought-provoking, and it challenged us. It's not that anything that Kevin said we didn't somehow know, but it was packaged in such a way that the impact, I'm sure, not just on us.
But you know what he did, which very few other people in the climate debate do? He didn't shy away, actually, from this word I just used with Taleb, which is pain. Sometimes we like to believe we can just sort of have our cake and eat it. We can suddenly become much more responsible. We can deal with the specific carbon emissions cuts we need to make, and somehow there won't be any, for all of us as individuals and as societies, much pain involved. And he's saying, actually, there will be some pain, and there's some really tough decisions to be made. And that's, in a way, the difference.
Okay, let me get to the pain thing. Unlike my friend Taleb, I'm not going to run away from the pain. I think there has to be a bit more pain. You don't win the rugby without going through a lot of pain. Sorry,
We
the
don't
English
win the
audience
rugby
here.
at
Yeah, we
all,
don't know.
pain
Sorry.
or not.
Sorry,
but-
wrong example. The fact is to get to where Kevin says we have to get to, and there is no doubt whatsoever that we have to get there. Otherwise, our survival as a species is very short-lived. And every great thing that we're doing today won't have a life beyond a few hundred years, which will make us the species that have probably been on this planet Earth for shorter than any other species, for that matter. There has to be pain, there has to be discomfort. But, you know, we have to do as governments, we have to do, and as generally as the public, we have to sort of embrace that pain and to say it's a necessary pain, necessary discomfort.
But are politicians who tend to see life in terms of 4 or 5 year election cycles prepared to deliver any message like that?
Well, you know, I've been around for 20 years and I've come to my, you know, the sell-by date, if you like, so I'm not too worried about the next election cycle for my career anyway. We have to do the right things as policymakers, as people in government. So there's no doubt whatsoever, but the answers are not simple. They're not simple, you know, so we shouldn't be simplistic about it. I mean, I think the pain might indeed entail less air travel, for example. Mm-hmm. But the challenge for the airlines would be to make sure that air travel becomes more sustainable and less carbon producing, if you like, or the carbon emissions are dramatically reduced, and that the sources of fuel are changed from fossil fuel to biofuels, for example. And that's a given.
And do you think, I mean, interestingly, you know, Richard from Boeing said, we're working on this and there's some very exciting technology, but we need massive help from government.
Yeah.
We need public money to deliver this change. As the only representative on the panel of a government, do you buy that argument?
That we need?
Well, that a company like Boeing says, you know, we can't make breakthrough technologies commercially viable. We can't develop this technology in an urgent fashion without a lot of public money. Does that make sense to you?
Well, it does make sense, but there are external factors that contribute towards change, and that pricing policy is very important. We're all happy that the oil price, or most people are happy that the oil price is low at the moment, but a low oil price means that you're not as driven as you would otherwise be to seek alternatives. So in governments themselves, you know, the policy framework includes pricing policy. People will, of course, suffer the pain if the cost of electricity is higher. If the cost of water is higher, people use their resources more efficiently. So it's a combination of carrot and stick, incentive and disincentive. So if you want people to radically change their behavior, it doesn't just happen. It has to, the framework has to be created, and governments have to take responsibility for the creation of that framework. So what are we doing in South Africa? It's not just about Boeing, it's what we do locally. I agree completely with Taleb that the benefits of tourism and the things that tourism encourages are not small. Tourism very often is the source of revenue that leads to communities doing different things with their environment, because you know the only potential gain in looking after your conserving your environment better would be the tourism revenue that flows from it very often. So tourism is a positive, apart from the many other positives that Taleb always so eloquently expresses. So you know you don't want to move away from encouraging people to travel and to have tourism grow, but Taleb is right, it's the kind of growth in tourism. And what measures do governments introduce to encourage a different kind of growth? What we're doing in South Africa at the moment, because we have to encourage responsible and sustainable tourism. We have a country that is characterized by deep inequalities, where we have serious developmental challenges and a fragile environment. So we have to change the way we do things. So what are we doing in respect to tourism? We are piloting a retrofitting program, which we will be expanding to the private sector next year, where government will largely subsidize establishments to change their energy source. I completely agree, change behavior first, efficient resource use starting point, the pain put on a jersey rather than put on a heater, use an additional blanket rather than a heater, but the source of energy also has to change. We have in South Africa an abundance of sunshine. So we part subsidize, or largely subsidize, the conversion of establishments from their reliance on grid electricity supply at the moment, or carbon fuels, if you like, and coal-generated electricity.
What proportion of your electricity in South Africa today comes from coal?
About 90%.
90%.
It's shocking. It's terrible.
Hideous.
And we have coal, and it's cheap coal, and we have to make the change.
Are you still building coal-fired power stations?
Oh, don't ask me an embarrassing question. Unfortunately, yes.
That would be a yes. Okay.
Unfortunately, yes. But are we moving dramatically in the direction of renewable energy? Probably one of the biggest programs in the world. The answer is also yes.
All right. Let me stop you there, Derek. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn the tables on Kevin now because, you know, I've been sort of his advocate with the rest of the panel to give them a hard time. But the fact is, every one of these panel members, but for you, has a responsibility to an immediate, as opposed to a more generalized responsibility, to stakeholders. Sorry to use a jargon word, but, you know.
Bigger responsibility towards the world at large.
Yeah, I know, but that's sort of an easy thing to say in a way. But, you know, Richard's got shareholders and he's got customers. Same goes for Brigitte, and Derek's got voters. And these people, you know, you're held to account in a very real sense by, you know, very clear relationship. You're just a, no offense, but a sort of ivory-towered academic and a thinker and a, you know, a learned man who, frankly, ploughs his own furrow and can say what he likes without any real sense of immediate comeback and accountability. So it's so much, frankly, bloody easier for you to deliver these messages, and it's so much more difficult for these folks to deliver. Do you accept that?
Yes, in many respects, but come back to what I was talking about was 2 degrees centigrade. I didn't set 2 degrees centigrade. The scientific community didn't set 2 degrees centigrade. The international community set 2 degrees centigrade. It is a decision of the messy international processes of civil society. It's the job of academics to say, well, you give us the target, 2 degrees C, by the end of the century, there or thereabouts, and we will go along, play with our computers, do a bit of maths, and tell you what that means. So, yeah, our job is easier in that we don't have you know, we don't have boards or immediate stakeholders. I mean, I do take the point, many of us work in this area because we do think we have stakeholders. I mean, my stakeholders aren't, well, they're all of us, but
You'd say humanity. You'd say humanity is your stakeholder.
Yes, broadly, yes. But I take the view that the 2 degrees C framework, though as a citizen, I think it's about the right one we should have had. Well, I think we should have actually gone for a lower temperature. But regardless of that, as a scientist, I simply take the threshold that I'm given and do the maths and the science and come out with the responses. Now, whether people like them or not is not my lookout.
Well, so, okay, true. So I now want you to assess what you've heard. You know, everybody on the panel in their different ways, and particularly Richard and Brigitte, who are working, you know, for big sort of profit-making corporates, are saying we're doing what we, you know, we're taking your message seriously. We are doing what we can. We've shifted our focus to a really serious degree towards sustainability issues and doing things differently. And we're delivering sort of percentage gains every year. Do you buy that? You know, they're not probably delivering what you would like, but do you accept that there has been a real sort of sea change here, and the language being used and the ambitions and the commitments being set are significant?
I mean this positively. The rhetoric has changed, and that's a good thing. The rhetoric has to change before you get any real change in the reality of the world. But nevertheless, every plot you have shows emissions going up. Every plot you have shows oil use going up, gas use going up, coal use going up. So none of the plots support the view that there's a tangible change in terms of the climate. What the climate sees are the increased number of CO2 molecules. So the efficiency of the planes have gone up, and the Dreamliner's there. But the Dreamliner now can travel further as a single flight from smaller airports, so it opens up new access to new routes. And we have Jevons paradox. Every time we save something in efficiency, we spend it somewhere else. You know, we can buy a jet ski or take another holiday. So these efficiency improvements are important, but in and of themselves, in the absence of an umbrella policy, they don't actually solve the problem. In fact, they can exacerbate the problem. That's not to say we shouldn't try and push them as hard as we possibly can. But this comes back, I think, as you go along the panel, what you get is, you know, companies doing, you know, good companies doing everything they reasonably can in the current framework, and there are lots of companies out trying to do this, and of course there are lots that aren't. But the framework needs to change to push these companies much harder and to allow them to work in a sort of probably more of a level playing field with other companies, so the stresses are not quite as great on any one company compared with others. But as you go along from this, I would come then to you put this together as best as you can, and I think it does beg questions in the short term about the growth model. And it's the temporal nature of that that's really important. What I'm saying is we cannot build the low carbon supply or get enough biofuel fast enough. And in the interim, because the carbon dioxide emissions are building up, We therefore have to, at the moment, there is no way I can see out of this. We have to reduce the level of consumption. And that pain is felt by relatively few of us. Some of our estimates are that 40 to 60% of global emissions come from 1 to 5% of the population.
It's us in the rich world who are going to have to bear the pain.
It is the rich, not the rich world. Because I say there are 300 million people in China. There are plenty of wealthy people in other parts of the world as well. It is the wealthy people, the high-emitting people, that will have to bear that pain. But I mean, in a sense, it's back to Bentham. You know, it's a pain calculation. We bear that pain, which means that we will have to, travel less holidays, less conferences, or travel very differently. But the pain that then is saved is the pain of people, the poor people who are eking out a living in the coastal strip of Bangladesh or on the deltas or in the more vulnerable communities around the world. I mean, there are many in South Africa. Even in our own country, we have people suffering fuel poverty. So the pain that we have to undergo is much less severe than the pain we're trying to save of other people whose lives will be severely impacted by climate change.
I understand that. But what Taleb said in his impassioned peroration at the end was that, what do you say to the people living on the small island community who are entirely dependent, because of the way their economy works, on the revenues that come in from tourism and aviation-based tourism in particular, and who would, never mind what you tell them about, 50 or 100 years off where their island might sink under the waves of a rising sea level, right now, if you did things, legislated in a way and created new pricing parameters which meant that those flights weren't coming in, those tourists weren't visiting that island, they would have no job, they would have no future. What do you say to them?
Well, the first thing I would ask them what they think we should be aiming for. And the Association of Small Island States, AOSIS rather, which has 40 member states, says it wants to aim for 1 to 1.5 degrees centigrade rise.
It doesn't say at the same time we are prepared to see our tourism industries collapse.
Well, maybe not the tourism, but the problem we've developed is a system that is, we've developed a globalized system which is premised on fossil fuels. Now, we have a choice. We can carry on doing that for the short term and then suffer the consequences of climate change, or make the very uncomfortable and challenging changes away from that now. Now, in the meantime, that was going to mean problems for these parts of the world. But then the point about the clarity and imagination, can we think of how to do that differently? They need that different income. These people did, of course, live on those islands reasonably sustainably, way before tourism ever arrived. So it's not as if that they've never lived. Tourism sort of came along and suddenly people popped up on the island. They have lived their low-carbon lifestyles there before. The globalized system we've got means that they are probably much more reliant now on a globalized tourist industry. And until we can find ways of doing that that are in line with, with a climate imperative, then we are going to have to do things that are uncomfortable for us and for them. And it may well mean that some of the negotiations in Paris will be about loss and damage. That if we cannot have tourism going to these parts of the world, then I think it is only right that the wealthy parts of the world should compensate. I don't see compensation.
Well, at the UN, is that...
Hang on, it's not compensation, actually. It's reparation. They are very different words. It's reparation, not compensation.
Taleb, how about that, as a way out of that particular problem you presented?
No, let me first apologize. I think I misheard when you said pain. I heard it as paying.
Ah.
So it was my wrong ear. I apologize for that. So
in your right ear, I did say pain, but are you saying you would accept the concept of, particularly the rich in the world, having to suck up quite a lot of pain and take fewer holidays, travel less, use aircraft less?
Yeah, but that should not mean that we should deny livelihood, decent livelihood with dignity for people that are not able.
No, but Kevin's
to be
addressed that. He's saying...
Let me just explain. I mean, I think what we're discussing here, Kevin's point is absolutely correct. We should never deviate from our targets. The 2% was not done out of the air. And we're not disputing that. We're not debating that. No. What I'm debating is, how do we get there? It's the conclusion. I think that we are not doing enough, with all due respect. And we cannot be doing more from the airline industries, from the transport industries, or from the hospitality industry if we don't earn more. They're not paying enough. I'm sorry to say this. You're not investing enough. You're not doing things fast enough. That's the reality. But to tell me that the only way we can reach this 2% is to reduce the growth and to let people fly less and build less hotels and consume less of whatever is consumed, that is not the solution. That is a defeatist attitude, and that's an attitude that we say, we can't do it, so let's stop it. No. I still believe that we are not doing enough. We're not doing enough as an industry, and to enable the industry to do more, we should let the industry earn more. And the only way the industry can earn more is by growth. And I still insist that growth is not the enemy. It's how we grow.
There is some agreement here. I mean, I do take the point.
Because we've got to wrap. So
Okay.
you tell me what the agreement is, because I want to end on a happy note. But there's been a lot of.
Well,
sort of-
we can do a huge amount more. We will have to argue about whether that can still fit in the growth model within a 2-decade period. I think probably not from the maths. And the other thing I would add, very important in this, the IMF, again, not a left-wing think tank, has worked out that the subsidy to fossil fuels, the annual subsidy to fossil fuels from the IMF is $5.2 trillion a year. Trillion, not billion. That's more than the global spend on health. These are the subsidies that are provided to the fossil fuel industry currently through a mixture of direct subsidies and of health subsidies as well. And that's from the IMF, 5.2 trillion. If that was simply removed, then we could solve a lot of these problems almost immediately. We wouldn't solve all these problems, but we would solve a lot of these problems. 5.2 trillion is a lot of money.
That I totally agree with. Totally.
Those words, that I totally agree with, are going to be the final contribution from the panel. You know, it's always the cliche of journalists or moderators like me to say, you know what, we can't solve the debate today, but I'm sure this debate will run and we'll revisit it again. Well, you know, it's cliche because it's sort of true. We can't solve anything today, but we can at least air issues in a thoughtful way. And I think thanks to Kevin, but also thanks to the responses we got from Richard, from Brigitte, from Taleb and from Derek, we've aired the issues, I hope, in a thoughtful way. We haven't sugarcoated it. And I hope we've given you all plenty to think about as you continue here at WTM. So, panel, I thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much indeed. And perhaps I can invite you to take your chairs again. Thank you. Thanks, Derek. So, that you know, is a great context in a way for us to tell you all now not to leave your seats. Please don't go, because the very important business of the World Responsible Tourism Awards is about to take place. So give us about 30, 45 seconds to change the stage furniture just a little bit, and the awards ceremony will begin. So stay right where you are, be patient, and we'll begin the awards.